Hi, this is Mike J, and welcome to Behavioral MetaDYNAMICS, an expose in leader development. The reason that I wrote this particular piece and the reason that I'm doing this overview audio is that we have been looking at post-conventional, or what is probably referred more often as postmodern leadership development, which means that the requirements have become increasingly complex. And the way in which we're going to approach that in this particular program is to give you a snapshot, just a quick summary of what our present situation is. In other words, we live in this world called VUCA. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And these are the conditions that are now calling forth the leader decision-making environment. And the idea in this particular program is to set up a program that works on itself by and of itself to create a psychodynamic or psychoactive response. In other words, what that means is that you study the program and the program behind the scenes begins to do the work, because our subconscious systems are filtering everything that we actually need to know, and even more than that, and then through our bias elements are kind of kicking that out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to use these 7 dynamics as really a postmodern or post-conventional toolkit, and then that allows you to develop the kinds of skills according to who you are, and then for us to scaffold the rest. If you look at my quick note in scaffolding, what I have found in almost 3 decades of coaching is it's very difficult to change people beyond their change capability. And that's usually within a structure of their current mode of reasoning, the way their worldview is set up. It's only when we get that discontinuous leap to the next worldview that we actually begin to change the way we're thinking about things. So rather than focusing and spending a significant amount of time on changing people directly, we create a psychoactive program that helps a person begin to develop skills that they'll need to change indirectly. And therefore, the process in real time is best scaffolded, which means hold up the person while they're in the state of change, while they're in the state of repair, while they're in the state of limitations. And while we do that, we solve the short-term problems that keep them from derailing, that keep them from driving people crazy, that keep them from not developing and not getting the work done, at the same time scaffolding the under process, the process that's running in parallel that's creating their future capability. So part of what we're trying to do in this system is to create this toolkit for you. Now in this slide, I've got elements of capability. Now some of you are going to look at this and you're going to say, whoa, this is super complex. And actually it is. But remember, I said it was psychoactive, which means you don't have to actually be able to do this stuff for this stuff to be actually working with you. When we look at what people said is the #1 competence or capability that leaders need to develop, it's self-awareness. But yet what we found in the research is this: we're all born into a particular potential for self-awareness. And therefore, does that mean you're going to be a good or bad leader based on whether or not you have self-awareness or not? Well, no, because there's a lot of other factors that go into self-awareness, and there are a lot of other things that we can do to scaffold what may be limitations that we have basically genetically in terms of how much self-awareness we will acquire over our working life, our leadership horizon. What we're going to do is help you learn about the language that you can use then to begin to discuss how to work in postmodern environment without necessarily having to be able to generate the language on your own. So capability brings in a lot of pieces, and what we'll do is help you learn about those pieces. Some you'll like, some you won't like. Some will be real meaningful to you, some won't. Some will be great for you, some won't. And therefore there is a range of activity. But when we look at capability, basically there are these 8 particular pieces, these sort of buckets that I have found over 3 decades of coaching that you've got to pay attention to: perspective, subjectivity, ego position, the way we language that world, the ability to perform complex tasks, the ability to understand our own talents and know where the limitations of those are, and something kind of new, I think, not new in terms of leadership vernacular, but new in terms of postmodern leadership development, is affect. one of the reasons that President Obama has gone as far as he did, whether you like him or don't like him, like his politics or don't like it, is affect. When he talks on a teleprompter, he inspires people. Now, whether it's in the right direction or not, I'm not here to judge that. But the point is he's able to create positive affect, optimistic affect. And that's something that's going to be key to postmodern conditions, because in uncertainty, a lot of times people are emotionally going to be looking for, is it safe here? Can we do this? Is there a future ahead of us? Do we have hope? And that's affect. And sense making is a new particular way in which we make sense out of things. Again, those are the components of capability. When we look at the state of leadership development, I've written some pieces there, and this audio is a companion piece to go along with the expose, so I won't go over those things. But you can look at those things. Again, behavioral metadynamics is designed as Occam's razor, or towards Occam's razor, to create the most for the least. There are a lot of other things that we could look at, but it's already too complex. And consequently, we have to be careful with how complex we make this, because we're dealing with a range of post-conventional people beginning to think early on about post-conventional development to people who are much more mature and need much more complex information. And bias is another dynamic, and what bias offers us is the opportunity to understand what do we filter and what are we biased and prejudiced about naturally, and then to build scaffolding around that, to either get people in place, information in place, to get other energy, to get other things going that we are not biased toward. That then creates the blind spot. Leadership blind spots are deadly, especially in the post-conventional environment. So bias begins to help us. Hey, these are the things that I pick up. Here are the things that I don't pick up. I'm going to need to get some help over here. And again, you'll notice that my tone and the way things change at postmodern and post-conventional leadership has to shift to collaborative work. We no longer have the one charismatic, know-it-all, patriarchal leader. The conditions are too complex. The situation is too variable. The ambiguity is too high for just one person with one set of filters to sit and work. And that's what we need to understand about bias. We have some ways in which to get at that. We practically teach people things about how they learn, how they manage conflict, what traits are most important to them, how they're motivated, what kind of type dynamics are going on in terms of extroversion, introversion, those kinds of things like that. And meta programs that are running, as well as the talent themes, and oftentimes we include something around the Enneagram to get some of the attentional and emotional ideas out into play. So again, that's a way that we create self-knowledge, which then leads to fulfilling the potential we have for self-awareness. In terms of emergence of leadership style, the thing that I have tried to understand over a long period of time is that people can't see inside the leader. What they do is they judge the leader by what they see coming out of the leader. So style has to be present, because style is what people see coming out of the leader, how they behave. When Hay McBear did their studies with David McClellan's work across organizations, I think there was like maybe 4,400 or 44,000 pieces of data. There was a lot of data. And what they found is that managerial style predicts about 70% of climate in the organization, and climate predicts about a third of the economic results. So the reason that style has to be in place is that style is a huge leverage point on what managers and leaders are attempting to get from the inside of them to the outside as it's perceived by others. So style becomes a very important process. This is something I've been working on for a long time, because style issues really recurse back into affect. They really come out of talent. They really have to do with how people see us take perspective or language, or what our ego position is. And a lot of the times we are ineffective in being able to control the transduction process. The transduction is what is in us to what gets delivered on the outside in a different energy form. And so style becomes important. You should know how other people think your style works or doesn't. And that's part of what we've done. I've created a style assessment, and we're working through a matrix of indicators and that sort of thing right there. In terms of level is important. Let me take you down to the graphic and what you should be seeing in the right-hand corner right now. There's a blue line and kind of a maroon reddish line. And what you see is capability moving at a fairly steady pace. That the slope of that curve is actually shifting to more of a hockey stick. And you're seeing that our people and our capability is creating a gap. What we have to be able to do in a postmodern environment is to find ways to augment, scaffold, or support our capability in the face of the job requirements. In a VUCA world, that's pretty complex. So what we need to first understand is we need to understand what's the current level of the job, what are the requirements there, where we are in terms of capability, and what that mismatch is going to create in terms of need for scaffolding. Again, change is something in a VUCA world that to me happens over time, and in real time it's going to be tough on most people because remember, most of our time, effort, energy, attention, and motivation is directed towards that conscious, that small conscious flashlight that we have, and we're relying on a huge subconscious system of what got us here to run in the background. In a VUCA world, we have to rely much, much more on that subconscious system, which is going to not be able to make changes in real time as quickly as we would like to. Therefore, we're going to need scaffold. And that's going to be the key. The complexity crisis that we have is that the level that the job requirements are coming in at and our capability to address those requirements at that particular level is waning in a significant number of conditions, and we've got to be able to close that gap. How do we close it? With change, skill development, training, yes, but more specifically in real-time scaffolding and design of how people can collaborate, use others, those kinds of things like that. I put together a real nice piece on individual differences in strategic leadership capacity. You should read that. And what it does is just reinforces the idea that we're in over our heads, as Robert Keegan said earlier in the 80s. The idea is that we just are in over our heads. So if we know we're in over our heads, then what do we need to do? Well, those are the tools that we need to begin to put together in terms of how we assess level, how we assess role. Role design is important because each of us as postmodern leaders and leadership developers are assuming multiple roles. And in some roles we do a great job, and in other roles where we have limitations that people notice right away. What we have to begin to understand about role work and matching the role to the level of requirements that are required is to make sure that we don't design in failure. A lot of what we're doing with role today, by doing job descriptions and all those kinds of things, are actually creating very complex tasks within particular roles where the people in those roles cannot perform particular functions. If you're going to leave the person in there because there's more good than there is bad, you've got to scaffold them. How do you do that? We have to understand role complexity. So we need to take a whole new look at role, and I hope you'll read through some of that. One of the things that we have to look at is this thing called volume. And what the word volume stands for is vertical, oblique, and lateral complexity for you and me. Volume. It's easy to remember, and the idea in a role is to dimensionalize it. We not only have to have the lateral complexity or the KSEs, but we have to understand the vertical capability or complexity that's involved, and we have to understand the transitional complexity or oblique complexity that is occurring in process. And we can actually begin to look at the role dimensions and begin to see where sometimes the role that we create for people is actually going to create a lot of failure, especially with particular people. Now, there are a lot of times we cannot find good fit, so we have to use warm bodies. And this is a particular time where we have to understand what's going on in that role, where the capability of the person is, what their biases are that may be helpful in scaffolding the process, and what the style used in the process is. The next thing we begin to look at is values. Now, I've copied heavily here from Dr. Don Beck and Spiral Dynamics, and the reason for this is simple. The values basins that Claire Graves discovered and codified hold well because each of the values basins in a particular set of conditions solves or promotes algorithms that solve those conditions best. None are better than the other. The key is fitness. So what we have to begin to understand is every one of us has a tendency to bias ourselves because of our constitutional attributes into those particular values basins. And of course, they're never pure. We always have our feet in a couple, straddling the fence, and as Dr. Beck says, chords of behavior. But the idea is once we begin to understand that, we then, through self-knowledge, can become aware of the fact that we're going to actually be good in some things and not so good in others. And in a VUCA world, you got to be good in almost everything. So where are you going to get the help for the areas that you're not too good in? That's where scaffolding, design, collaboration come in. So first you got to know what values are going on. You got to know organizational values. You got to know the cultural values. If you're working in another country, like I'm speaking to you right now from the Philippines, the values here are dramatically different than where I lived before in Russia. Those values are dramatically different than where I lived before in Latin America. Those values are different than North America. So again, we have to understand what the figure and ground are in the context of values before we begin to set in place what is actually going to occur in the whole process. Now, the last thing I want to mention to you is probably strategically the most important for leaders, and that would be the idea behind system dynamics. System dynamics was created by Jay Forrester in the mid-50s at MIT, and it is not an easy system to use because of the modeling and simulation software that goes along with it and the way in which you need to think about system dynamics. It's actually a meta-systematic system. It's not systems thinking. It's system dynamics, and those two are at two different levels of complexity. So while we need systematic thinking, we also need meta-systematic thinking, and therefore being able to understand, for instance, the structure of an industry. If you're in finance, there's a structural thing that's going on with intermediation and interest rates and all the different kinds of things that work there. The same thing if you're in automobiles. The same thing would be as if you're in retail. There's a different structure of how things work, and how things working the way they work cause things to happen. We need to understand that, because essentially, remember, this is a meta system, which means it's about a system, which means it works on itself. And therefore, system dynamics of leader modeling is important, because each one of us has X amount of capability, Y amount of bias, Z amount of style. You see what I'm saying? And each one of us plugged into the simulations model will actually create a different kind of behavior. That's why we call it behavioral metadynamics. The keys then would be, once you identify the key competencies or the business indicators or the skills that you need, to then be able to say, well, look, these are the things I do well. These are the things I don't do so well. I want to work on some of these over time, but I want to get some help on a lot of these. And how do I begin to reach out, which is the #1 key to resilience, and then to prevent, which is the #1 key to anti-fragility, the crashing of the system. So those are some things I wanted to talk about. In summary, what I've done is I've listed some advantages and disadvantages. I think you can read those. I have mentioned a lot of them through the course of time. This is a complex system. It is going to take somebody to help you with it in most cases, because we're only aware of so much. I've spent the last 3 decades trying to study this stuff and its effect on leaders, and therefore I have a little bit of something to say in terms of all the different things that we're looking at that will begin to be root cause variables that will help somebody. Listen, if you understand perspective taking and all the issues with perspective taking, I can promise you that everything in your life will shift. If you look at your ego position, I can promise you everything in your life will shift. These are the kinds of things that are built into this toolkit. And while we may not be able to or want to learn all of these things are going on anyway. So wouldn't you like to know about them? And that's the key thing in this development process. I do have a retreat, 2 retreats scheduled. One in December of 2014, probably a little too late for some of you. An after retreat scheduled in 2015, and then during 2015, I'm going to pedagogically go over the instructional elements of this system for those few people that want to say, I'd like to be able to work with you closer, Mike, and work in this system with your projects. You need to know this stuff. So that's the kind of experience that you'll get. The programs are done virtually. You can learn this stuff by listening and studying on your own. And again, this is a big point of this whole modeling system. The shift that leadership development is coming out of HR and coming out of training programs and coming out of expertise is no longer the case. Each one of you will need to take accountability and responsibility for your own leadership development. The program that I'm going to teach you gives you the tools with which to manifest the things that you'll need to do to take over your leadership development. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close it. I wanted to keep this short as possible. I hope you will read the Behavioral Metadynamics Expose. Later next year in 2015, this will become a white paper when I put all the references in, but I didn't want to continue to hold this because we've actually got some things going on in the inner circle and other things that some people might want to get in and get involved with at the very early stages. If you're a person who's assessing capability, if you're a person who's doing a lot of developmental coaching, if you're a person who's doing executive coaching, this program will give you an edge. And the reason it will give you an edge, it will help you begin to understand what you need to do for yourself, and then later on how to begin to inquire and to advise and to consult with your clients about the things that they need to do for themselves. With that being said, there's some links in the program that you can have a look at, and I hope you'll click on those and let us know if you have comments or suggestions. Thanks very much. This is Mike J. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. 2014.